down today to share with us your knowledge of the housing court. Now, for many people that may see this video, they may not know who you are or what you've done or what your experience has been. Could you give us some of your background and how you became involved with housing court?
If I gave you my background, I think we'd be here for until Christmas time. But thank you for asking, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to see an old friend. If I can make a mention of you, Ernie, who was a clerk up in the court, and whom I've known for many years. How far back do you want me to go?
Well, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the housing court. I believe you had some involvement with the legislation that created the housing court, and were on the advisory council. You were also a judge in the housing court, were you?
Yes.
Okay, that would be a good place to start.
All right. My involvement with the housing part of the civil court, as it's officially known, came about almost by accident, as many things in life do. I was practicing law and had been involved in the development of Mitchell-Lama housing and artists in residence and many aspects of housing, and I used to go into the criminal court, which is where housing violations originally were heard by criminal court judges who clearly had no appreciation or understanding, it seemed to many of us, of what was really going on in terms of housing violations. And so they treated them very superficially and never were really successful in getting housing violations corrected. And that seemed to be something of importance to many of us. And I learned that the city of Baltimore had come up with a housing court. I went down there and saw how they were operating, and then Boston came along too and had another variation of it. And I did a little bit more investigation and found that several years prior to that involvement by me, Professor Frank Grad up at Columbia with the Legislative Drafting Fund had written some legislation or proposed a housing court for the city. And so I put that in the back of my head, and then I was taking a doctorate at the time after I'd gotten a master's at NYU Law School, and there were no more courses for me to take at NYU, so I went to New York Law School and proceeded to take a doctorate and had to write a thesis, and my thesis included the idea of a housing court. I spoke with the Community Service Society and other agencies who all had ideas, and so I filtered those into the thesis that I did. And ultimately, or concomitantly with it, I became special counsel to the minority leader of the New York State Assembly, Stanley Steingut, and also became his housing consultant. One day I went to the Housing Committee meeting of the New York State Assembly, and I heard a proposal for an administrative tribunal that Governor Rockefeller, for whom I must say I came to have very high regard, even though I was a Democrat, I found that he was genuinely interested in preserving the housing stock for the city of New York. And he had before his desk, or in front, or on his desk, a proposal by Senator Roy Goodman. And I'm mentioning these names because they all figure very prominently in what has turned out to be the housing court for the city of New York. Roy had a bill for an administrative tribunal, and it was at that time considered the governor's bill. Well, at this housing committee meeting of the assembly, when I heard about an administrative tribunal, I said in my typical fashion, "Oh no." And the Republican chairman of the committee looked over at me and he said, "All right, you got a better idea?" And I don't want to sound feminine about it, but I said, "Well, yes, Mr. Chairman, I do." And he said, "What is that?" And I said, "A housing court." And he looked at me over his glasses and said, "Okay, over Easter you can come in with a bill." And I said, "I will," naive as I was. And I spent my Easter vacation putting together all the ideas that I had accumulated over a period of time. And when the session resumed, I had a bill. At which point, he was the initial sponsor of the bill, but being, I won't say anti-feminist, I think McCarthy would resent that probably, but he then turned to Rosemary Gunning, who was an assemblywoman, a Republican conservative from Queens, and he said to her, "Rosemary, would you take this on as the sponsor?" Well, lo and behold, there I was counsel to the Democratic minority leader, and I'm suddenly married to a Republican conservative from Queens, Rosemary Gunning. But it turned out to be a very fortuitous thing, because Rosemary Gunning, may she rest in peace, because she was a very special lady. She looked like a little jelly apple, and with her gray hair and big cheery smile, and she was very popular, and she was very concerned about the small homeowners, the small buildings in her district, and she felt that they were being unfairly attacked by the building department because it was easy for the inspectors to go to her district. It was safe. And so she said, "I'll be happy to do it." And I said, "Well, Mr. Chairman, don't you think we ought to make it a bipartisan kind of thing if it's going to succeed?" And he then turned to the Democratic minority member on the Housing Committee named Seymour Posner from the Bronx, who was a very liberal gentleman, and an interesting marriage took place with Rosemary Gunning and Seymour Posner, and me performing the vows for the two of them, and we all got along just absolutely fine. And that is, Rosemary and I worked on it, and Seymour and I worked on it, and I finally came up with, after many days and nights of working on it, a bill that I won't say was satisfactory in all aspects, but at least tried to incorporate. I should indicate, too, that we went around the state holding hearings, and Mr. Steingart, who was my boss at the time, was very curious about how was I going along with Rosemary Gunning and Seymour Posner, holding these hearings, and because you see, Mr. Steingart at the time liked the idea of an administrative tribunal because he was friendly with the then mayor, Mr. Lindsay. And so I was put in the difficult position of trying to pacify Mr. Steingart, who was, he liked the idea of an administrative tribunal, and I remember his calling me once when I was in some judge's chambers, and I went out into the hall in Supreme Court to call him back, and he said, "How is it that you, my counsel, is working with a Republican conservative assemblywoman, and when you know that I am beholden to Mr. Lindsay, and how will I get any of these appointments on this court. And I said, well, Stanley, some things are above politics, or should be. And this court, what we have in mind, what I have in mind, is a prototype, perhaps, for the way judges should be selected based upon merit and background. And can't we forget politics for once? And he said, someday you'll learn that there's nothing in government that is beyond politics. And that turned out to be very true, because what has happened over the years, as I see it, much to my disappointment, has been that it has become politicized, and to some degree, to a great degree, sadly, and the history of how this eventually became a functioning court is peppered throughout with political considerations. Anyway, what happened thereafter was that the governor still had a bill on the table, and Senator Goodman was vigorously following it up. The governor had appointed, or somebody in his office had appointed, the late Judge Botein, who was the presiding judge of the Appellate Division First Department, as chair of a committee to eliminate unnecessary and inappropriate jurisdiction, was the name of it. And so we had several meetings with him and with the two presiding justices of the Appellate Division. Botein was no longer the chair, was no longer the presiding judge. There was Judge Stevens and might have been Galata. And I will only tell you that I think my blood was all over the floor of the New York State Senate, because so much pressure was being put on me along the way, because the governor had a bill, and now we had a bill co-sponsored by a leading Republican woman and Assemblyman Posner, and there was a lot of support for it. As a matter of fact, I went around collecting support for that bill. I followed Senator Knorr from Queens into the men's room once to get him to go on the bill. These are just memories that keep flooding back to me, because I think it tells you something about how a bill gets passed in Albany. When people have said, well, we should get a bill, I don't think they have any idea of what you have to go through. Moreover, I don't think that anybody recognizes that if someone feels very strongly about a piece of legislation, as I did, that we will dedicate ourselves to seeing and doing whatever it takes, so that in addition to getting tremendous number of assembly sponsors on the bill, I was able to get the Citizens Union, the operating engineers, the Board of Trade, I can't even begin to tell you the long list of sponsors across the spectrum who became supporters. Everybody had some ideas, and where possible, I'd spend weekends alone in the Capitol typing out some changes and going over them ultimately with Rosemary and Cy Posner. However, what I didn't anticipate was that there would be a very strong opposition from, and it's ironic that this program will be shown at the City Bar, because the Association of the Bar, or the City of New York Committee, was opposed to it. And Rosemary and I spent a lot of time going to those meetings with them, trying to persuade them that this was something that would help the situation in New York, because just as today there isn't an adequate supply of housing for low and moderate income people. There wasn't back then either, and not much has changed. If anything, I think it's gotten worse. Every time I hear the word affordable housing, my antenna go up and I say, affordable for whom? Maybe that comes from the fact that my father died when I was 6 years of age, and my mother at the time, who had no occupation and worked in a fish market and then a bakery, and we were on widow's pension and food stamps, which at that time gave us cabbage and lard as surplus food. I realized very young, it was when I was very young, that housing just is really one of the basic things in life for most people. And when you've gone to as many apartments as I did as a housing judge and see the cockroaches and the conditions under which people lived, I realized that we've got to do something. Unfortunately, today, nobody gets, when you look at Barclay Center, that everybody thinks is a great thing in Brooklyn, and I think of the housing that has been destroyed to make way for that, and where are those people living, you become very conscious about the need for decent housing and code enforcement, and how difficult it is for the average person to do anything. One of the provisions in the housing court that I want to emphasize, because I don't think it's really used enough, is that for the first time we gave tenants the opportunity to start an action. They didn't have to wait until there was an eviction proceeding against them to allege that there was conditions that didn't warrant the payment of rent or that needed to be rectified. So we gave tenants that opportunity to bring a tenant-initiated action, because when I subsequently became a housing judge, I realized that getting the city of New York to bring such an action was a gesture very often in futility. But that's a story, I guess, for another day. In any event, getting back to how this became law, the first year we couldn't get it passed. It came out of committee, but there was opposition. And as I indicated before, one of our strong opponents was the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, and we had to meet with them, and the then chairman, a gentleman by the name of Louis Isaacs, who became subsequently, ironically, the chairman of the advisory council, opposed it. And as far as the governor's bill was concerned, their politics entered into it. Roy Goodman wouldn't talk to me for a couple of years because he got a call from the Republican county chairman at the time, Vincent Albano, and Vince called him out of the chambers and spoke to him on the phone, and Roy came back into the chambers and said to me, "Did you talk to Vinny Albano? Because I just got a call from him and he told me to pull that bill out." And I said, "Roy, I don't know what Vinny told you, but apparently the governor has decided, for whatever reason, that that bill should not go forward." One morning in Albany, and I spent a lot of time up there, I will tell you, at a nominal amount of money, I think $500 I got for the session, because Stanley Steingart didn't want to waste any of his money on me, because I was not carrying what the mayor wanted. One morning, a Sunday morning in the library, there was some kind of a coffee hour, and Malcolm Wilson, who was then the lieutenant governor, came over to me and said, "The governor likes your bill." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, the governor likes your bill, and he has decided that his committee to eliminate unnecessary and inappropriate jurisdiction, and he's talked to Judge Botein, and he likes your bill." And I said, "Well, I'm glad to hear that. You know, after all, I was a relatively young lawyer at the time, and that was a great compliment. I subsequently learned that it wasn't only that he liked my bill, it was that he didn't want to give the mayor of the city of New York any patronage in appointing the housing judges, or as they were subsequently called, referees, and they didn't know what to call them. And so the governor pulled out his bill. Roy Goodman wouldn't talk to me for a couple of years. Malcolm Wilson came to a party that I gave to celebrate it, and I think that may telescope for you how a bill gets passed in Albany. Everybody has their own agenda, and until you know what people's agenda is or are, you really don't know how to attack it. But there were a lot of people that were involved in this, and in looking through today before I came, some of the letters of support, telegrams, correspondence to the governor's council at the time about signing or not signing the bill when it finally passed. And I should indicate to you that when the bill passed in 1972, it's 110 of the Civil Court Act, the vote was tremendously in favor of this, and that was on both sides of the aisle. I remember one somebody who became a state senator later, he was an assemblyman, when there was a lot of argument on the floor by a couple of diehards that Rosemary had not been able to persuade, I guess, because it's reminiscent of what goes on in Washington today, that there were some diehards that didn't want anything to happen. And even though they were Republicans, they still argued against it. But a Republican assemblyman from Westchester, who later became a senator, made a very telling speech, and he said, "I will trust a court any day, but administrative agencies never. They make their own rules, and nobody ever knows what they are, and they interpret them the way they want. The people will trust a court." And Rosemary Gunning and I had found in the hearings around the state that that was true. People who testified said, at least with a court there's precedent, there are rules, there are statutes, and you can always take an appeal. With an administrative tribunal, you don't know what you're going to get. And that's very true. And if I may just interject, because I feel this very keenly, even today, with the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal, you don't know what they're up to. On major capital improvements, they operate, as one of their bureau chiefs said, well, we've always done it that way. And they are holdovers from the days of the Republican-dominated state government. So tenants are in a very bad position when it comes to major capital improvements or rent regulations, etc. And I think of this whole thing in terms of housing and where we are with problems that people face today, and why the housing court needs, even now, another hard look. Because I've been the chairman of the advisory council, and I don't know if they've ever finally issued a report that I provided for in the statute. The last time I saw a report from that advisory council was 1988, when I think Judge Eddie Thompson, may he rest in peace, who was a great administrative judge of the Civil Court of the City of New York, and I really miss that man. He sat down and put together a draft. but I haven't seen one since then. And the advisory council is mandated to issue a report so that to the public, to the legislature, etc. But nobody follows that up. There are a lot of things that I think it's time that it shouldn't be business as usual. I was amazed to hear from somebody who went down to be interviewed as a housing judge that the door opened up and the chief judge of the Court of Appeals whisked him inside to interview him. This was not what was contemplated. I have been down at Beaver Street, which is where the Office of Court Administration is, and found that the citywide administrative judge was interviewing somebody. The statute originally provided that the administrative judge, that's what I wrote, should be the appointing power, but I never thought that the administrative judge would turn out to be the chief judge of the Court of Appeals or the citywide administrative judge.
Who was the person in your contemplation who would do the appointing? Were you talking about the administrative judge for the civil court for the city?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, because, and I'm glad you asked that question, because that goes to the whole idea of qualifications. How do you interview somebody to be a housing judge, something that's so different from perhaps other fields of law, and having been a Supreme Court judge now, and a criminal court judge, and a housing judge, and having practiced for many years, both before I went on the bench and since then, if you don't have any idea of what's involved, and it's different. There's no substitute for experience. And I was amused, if I can say amused, when I saw the names that came out just now from the commission on it's making for the Court of Appeals. All right, at the Court of Appeals, you don't have to know anything about housing, or a lot of things, I suppose, but the whole idea that was behind the housing court, not the whole idea, but certainly a feature of it, was that you don't hire a surgeon who has no background in medicine or the field on which that surgeon is to operate. The bench is no place for on-job training. And I suppose you could point to Judith Kay and say she had no judicial experience and she turned out to be a great judge. But that's an exception, I think, that comes along once in many, many, many years. When you look at the current group that have been suggested for the Court of Appeals, well, they may be fine people, and there's certainly diversity among all of them, but there isn't one person that combines all of those things. And what we tried to do with the Housing Court, what I tried to do with the Housing Court, was to say that they should have a knowledge of real estate and court procedure, etc. And when we interviewed people, I remember we had a tremendous number of applicants in the first couple of years. We found that there was diversity in many aspects, but we wanted a special kind of person to sit on the Housing Court.
I just want to back you up a little bit.
Sure.
You spoke about getting this bill eventually passed to create the Housing Court. The governor eventually signs the bill. The Housing Court is created. Were you involved with the initial advisory council, or?
Yes.
You were?
Yeah.
Okay, and for how long did you sit on the advisory council?
No, the original advisory council was chaired by Judge Botein. He was the first one. I was not on the advisory. No, let me take that back. I was on, I think, on the advisory council then. He was the chairman. And then he was followed, if I remember correctly, by a marvelous little man who was a minister, that Judge Thompson and I went out to his house even to visit him. and we had dinner in a Bedford-Stuyvesant interesting restaurant. And then I became the chairman of the advisory council. And Gary Sperling, who is, well, I don't know where Gary is these days. He was the executive director of Citizens Union. We decided when we were interviewing people that we needed to have some more formal kind of thing, and so we devised an application form. I was looking today at the application form that is currently in use, and I must suggest to you that this application form for housing judges is more, it's 25 pages, it's more detailed than probably than for the Court of Appeals. So, but I don't know that it tells very much about a person's attitude or experience or background in housing. I guess I was Don Quixote, tilting at windmills, hoping to find a prototype that could be used. I will say to you that most of the people that we did interview were pretty good.
Now, during those first appointments to the housing court, who made the appointments in those years?
We had a series of interviews, committee interviews, and then the entire advisory council, and then we made recommendations to Judge Thompson, Eddie Thompson. He was the citywide administrative judge of the civil court, and he was a strong supporter of the idea of the housing court from the beginning. And I didn't know him from a hole in the head. And I remember when I called him up one day and said, Judge Thompson, Assemblywoman Gunning and I would like to meet with you. We want to talk to you about the creation of a housing part of the civil court. I remember hearing him say to the clerk of the court, who happened to be sitting there, and I can't remember his name, may have been Roland or something like that, hey, there's some babe on the phone that wants to give me a housing court. That was Eddie Thompson. And he said, sure, come on down. He knew Rosemary from Queens. And we went down there, and he really grilled us. And then he said, you know, I think you got a hell of an idea, and let's go with it. And he was really right there. He really put his heart and soul into the housing court, the advisory council, the people that he put on it, and he was very careful. I mean, that was the first time I met Fred Trump. He appointed Fred Trump to the advisory council. Now, Fred Trump certainly had built more housing, had more tenants, and a man quite unlike, I might say, his issue or his progeny. But Fred Trump would sit there and without a calculator, without anything, he'd say, wait a minute. He said, they should have black robes. They're acting like judges. They've got the powers. He said, and that court, just a minute, I'll always remember him. He was an interesting man. In his brain, he was calculating. He said, that court brings in more money than other parts of the court system, and they should be treated like judges. And Fred Trump and Eddie Sulzberger, who was then a leading managing agent and owner, and John McGrath from one of the banks, the four of us went to every court, every housing part, to see how they were functioning. We also had lunch in the meantime and talked about it, but these were the kind of people that Eddie Thompson appointed to that advisory council. And they were sincerely interested. And I have not been to an advisory council. They don't invite me. I wish they would, because I'd like to know more about how my baby is functioning. Rosemary Gunning, as a matter of fact, and I'm very proud of this, had a special print made of the original bill, and I just happen to have it with me. And she called it the Lorraine Miller bill. This was a photostat of it. She had a special print made, And up at the top to Lorraine gratefully and affectionately, Rosemary Gunning. And it was March 7th of 1972. So,
Now, how long after you were on the advisory council did you become a member of the housing court bench? When were you appointed to housing court?
I don't remember, it was a couple of years, but it was, I don't know, Eddie Thompson said, he called me one day and he said, I have one vacancy on the advisory council, one vacancy on the bench. He said, I'd like you to take it. And I said, yeah, but Judge, I have a good practice and I'm building housing. And he said, take it for a year and see what you've created. Then you can make some changes as you see them. And he said, until you're inside and actually doing it, you don't know what you've created. And I said, well, what do I do with my practice? And he said, ask your husband. Typical male viewpoint, right? And I said, you don't know my husband. In any event, the 1 year turned into 3 years on the housing court. And the first thing that Ed Thompson did was send me up to the Bronx, which is where he said he needed me. Watch out for your friends because you don't know what they're going to do to you. The Bronx was the toughest place. And it was in the basement of the Supreme Court building. And you went in sort of through the back, and I had a hole in the window in back of me, and I wore my ski pajamas once. I was so cold. By then we had gotten some robes with the robe over it, and it was a small courtroom, and there was a very vigilant group up there then. When I say vigilant, legal aid people, they were probably the most sane of all of the attorneys that came before me. The others were more proactive, and if ever there was training that was needed for judicial temperament, sitting in the housing court, and I want to make it very plain, I think it's the toughest job in the world. If you survive that place and the emotions, and you see, particularly in the last several years, a lot of women come in with little children, babies in arms even, and Judge Kay, to her credit, at one time had established like a nursery here in this building.
All of the housing courts.
Well, I saw it here, how it functioned, and then I think the money disappeared for it, but in any event, the Bronx was the first place that I worked, and I found a very entrenched real estate group up there of lawyers, some of whom are still there, who were pulling all kinds of things, I felt, on tenants. One of the lawyers even sued me. And Judge Herbert Evans, who was on the Supreme Court, subsequently became the citywide administrative judge, said in his courtroom, he said to me, why don't you write them out a check? And I said it would bounce to the ceiling. He said they deserve it because they were looking, to give me a hard time. It's very difficult, and it may sound very self-serving, to have a conscience about some of these things, or to care. And, but I think that's what judges are for. One of the things in the legislation that I also want to point out is that judges subsequently, well, they were originally called referees, and then the constitutionality was challenged, and I think it was Judge J. Irwin Shapiro that upheld the constitutionality. They did not have equity power, but one of the provisions I put in there originally, which was fortunately interpreted, I think, correctly thereafter, was that notwithstanding the relief sought, the court may employ any remedy, procedure, program, I forget my language, that is appropriate, which was the broadest type of power I think, ever given to a judge, short of the Court of Appeals maybe, and I'm not sure that they even have it. But unfortunately, I don't think a lot of the housing judges use it. I think they're a little intimidated. There was a bill subsequent to our bill by Ornstein and Conklin, I think a couple of years thereafter, in 1977, that extended the terms from 3 years to 5 years. And the housing judges more recently have been asking that that term be extended. OCA, Office of Court Administration, has supported the idea. I have not gotten involved in it, and I don't know whether it's a good idea or not. Probably is, because it's important that housing judges, if they're going to act like judges and have such broad powers, that they have the independence and not be afraid of the rigmarole that goes on when they have to be reappointed. On the other side of that argument, though, if I may just indicate that, is that the idea is that there should be an influx of new people, otherwise it becomes stale, and I think in some ways that has happened in the housing court. We've always done it that way, is the philosophy, and that's not what we had in mind.
Well, I think certainly the court has expanded over the years. We now have a bench of 50 judges, and on the average, I'd say there's probably 2 or 3 openings every year based upon either judges being elected to civil, some retiring, some not being reappointed.
Mm-hmm.
Some people just, it's not for everybody.
No, it certainly isn't, and maybe that's the advisory council's fault in the initial interviewing, because I think the intent, as set forth in the preamble, has gotten lost somewhere. I think, as was told to me by, at that time, Al Walsh, who was the head of the Housing and Development Administration and part of the Lindsay administration, and had died in the Wool Republican, he said to me, "Wait and see, this is going to be just as political as every other court." And I said over my dead body, well,
do you feel now that when somebody such as the chief judge for the Court of Appeals is now getting involved in the appointment process, do you feel that that reflects how much more political the court has become from its inception? That the appointment is now done by the deputy chief administrative judge of the whole state of New York, as opposed to the supervising judge of the civil court of the city of New York?
Well, I can't separate that from the personalities that are involved. If it was Judge Lippman, for whom I have great affection, because I've known him for many years. I know where he comes from the Lower East Side. His father was involved with the amalgamated housing on Grand Street, and I served with Ralph Lippman on several committees years ago on the Lower East Side. But that did not make Ralph Lippman a landlord, and it doesn't make Jonathan a landlord. Jonathan is a very decent human being. My problem with Jonathan being involved, if he is that I don't know how that man ever gets any sleep, because he's in 40 places. He'll probably be here this afternoon at the Supreme Court thing that Judge Fisher is holding. And now his deputy is Gail Prudenti from Suffolk County, and Fern Fisher is the deputy or citywide. I don't know what her current title is. It's very hard to separate these things, but I think that there's a certain structure that should be in place no matter who the people are, and so that if somebody is interested in applying, they know what's going to be, and not just leave it up to chance, which is what is wrong with the appointive system that we have in the criminal court and the family court, and and then the mayor gets involved, and a candidate is told that there are two openings, and then suddenly a third opening arrives and somebody else is appointed. I'm only reciting that from not personal experience, but from what others have told me. Do I think that makes it political? I think there's a danger, yes, and that's what we were trying to eliminate.
In 1998, I'm sure maybe you are aware that they changed the way that the Housing Court functions, that they created the Housing Court Initiative, which designated many parts as resolution only, some are trial parts, there's an HP part, there's a co-op part, a drug part, and various other specialty parts. Have you been able to observe the difference in the court from the time the initiative was implemented, or you've really been removed from daily observation or regular observation of the housing court and how it works?
I haven't, in all honesty, I have not had personal experience with it, nor have I been invited to say, what do you think, you know? From what I have heard and the very limited experience I've had with the one in Brooklyn, I'm not sure that it's any better, right? You're shaking your head where you must have something, and I'll be happy to hear your view about it when we go off the record. But I don't think that's any better. I think the time has come after 40 years that we took a look at how has this worked. Is it better? Would it have been better to have an administrative tribunal? I mean, I'm not wedded to my baby. I'd like to know before the Grim Reaper comes along and puts an end to my thinking about it, about whether I was Don Quixote. Was I dreaming? Was I naive?
What makes you feel that the court isn't working in the way that you had intended when you drafted the legislation?
Have you ever tried to get the Department of Buildings on the telephone? Right? Have you ever tried getting anybody on the telephone these days without talking to a recording about hold on, and then you get disconnected? I think of the poor little woman, and it's usually a woman with a baby or two who maybe doesn't speak English very well, trying to report a condition. What is she supposed to do? Run down to 141 Livingston Street? Stand online for 4 or 5 hours?
Well, I know many litigants that appear before me in court. They're certainly aware of calling 311 to report a violation. And they do often, you know, just in defense of HPD to a degree, they come in with receipts or acknowledgments of their complaints. I think as a function of the housing court, we are more dependent upon the enforcement policies of HPD with respect to either commencing actions against landlords for not correcting violations and certifying, bringing 7A proceedings, all these compliance, you know, and perhaps even with their staffing cuts, they don't have sufficient inspectors to send out to cover all of the complaints that do come in. Again, that is only one function of the court, and that the courts can only do so much with the volume that's going through the housing courts these days because of the economy, and certainly I think other judges would say that over the years, depending on the borough, that the housing stock has in fact improved. And I think that had a lot more to do with the market, and that houses became more valuable, rents went higher, landlords had more money to put into these apartments. I'm not saying it's a solution to what you're talking about as far as affordable housing and dealing with our massive poverty population here. There's certainly insufficient housing for them, and the more that there are budget cuts, the less options they have to remain in the city or to live in the city in a decent apartment. But I don't know that the court should take the hit for that particular situation. There's only limited things that the court can do.
That has been the argument from day one. There's never enough money to do everything. But there's enough money I've seen to carpet certain offices and premises and buy new furniture and so forth, without my being specific about it. There's always money if somebody has a genuine concern. I'm not sure that that concern exists now, and it was frankly one of the things I felt about Governor Rockefeller at the time. Aside from his political animosity or antagonism towards our then mayor, I think he was genuinely concerned. As a billionaire, it was remarkable, but he did care. And we had Mitchell-Honor housing then. We don't have any housing programs now. There's always money for things like Barclay Center, but there isn't money for the people who were removed from there. I don't know where they've gone. Somebody ought to do a study on where they've had to move out to. You may feel, Judge, that things have gotten a little better. I hope that they've gotten better, however much it is, but not to the degree that I think is possible. I don't think there's a concern anymore when I see some of the bills that have come out of both the City Council and the Assembly. When I see the attitude of DHCR, the state agency. Our governor said that it was going to be a people's program. That's what he said last year when he went on a tour upstate with Commissioner Darrell Towns. Yet his rent division are the same holdovers as they've been for years, and when they were asked about how do you accept papers signed by expediters, in quotes, expediters, who have no background, who don't have to swear to anything, they merely affirm, and what district attorney is going to pursue it? And they say, well, we've always done it that way. Well, tell that to the lady that's got the cockroaches and no heat and no hot water. Now, I'm not saying tenants are blameless. I never felt that way, because I've seen too many incinerators in buildings filled with garbage up to the top, and it didn't get there because the landlord put it there. You know, there are two sides to this thing, and one thing I think being a judge taught me over the years, that if you're going to be a good one, you better be right down the middle and see both sides of it, and I'm sure you would agree with that.
Absolutely.
And I tried to I know, but let's not lose sight of the fact that there's still a very strong real estate component in this city, and they have gotten the tax abatements and the J51s and look at Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper. What happened to them? They're finally getting some kind of rebates. They don't build those anymore, and I don't know. I just don't know. I think as an answer again to your question, that I think it's time that we took another overall look at the whole thing and not issue just another report. There's enough paper floating around this. There are enough trees that are denuded because there's so much paper. Having worked up in the legislature before I went on the bench, and having been on the bench, and being tempted myself now that I'm back in the real world of plowing through papers and papers and papers submitted, I know that nobody really ever reads them. And if you do, you can't remember everything you read. But I think that, you know, this occasion of a 40th anniversary might be an occasion when it should be recommended that we take another whole look. I have no pride in authorship, and if somebody wants to say the court is a flop, well, my feelings won't be hurt. But I think, you know, that it's very difficult when you have entrenched real estate people, and I know that in talking with Ernie before, I understand one of them was here before and has testified and has been on the advisory council. And much to my amazement, when there was some kind of a seminar or program, I think at the county lawyers, there was a footnote that a certain real estate law firm was sponsoring the reception. And I spoke to Judge Kay at the time because she was supposed to be there. And I said to her, how can we justify that? That the law firm has a representative on the advisory council, and we say that we're an impartial group and they're sponsoring it? All right, the cup of coffee is not going to buy anybody's viewpoint, but there's a public perception that's been going on for years about, oh, this is landlord-oriented. And I said the whole idea of this housing court and the people that we initially selected was to try to get away from that. And I must say that after I left the housing court and ran for civil court and then Supreme Court and all the rest of it, I lost touch with it. But by the same token, nobody's ever invited me back. Nobody's ever asked my view about how do you think it's working? And so sometimes you have to know, what is it the card players say? You have to know when to get up and leave the table and leave it alone. But I appreciate this opportunity of you asking me to speak. I wish I could tell you, yes, this has been a great success, but I'm afraid it hasn't been. And I'm the first one to admit it. But then nothing is perfect. We'll just keep working on it, and hopefully I'll be given the opportunity to do a little bit more to try to make it better.